Tuesday, October 15th. Beatrice Connor turned on the coffee maker at 5:30 in the morning, as she had done every day for the past 8 years. Outside the kitchen window, rain pounded on the roof of their one-story house on Maple Street in Greystone, Ohio. The house was quiet as usual. Bert was still asleep, and Tommy didn't get up until 7. At 35, Beatrice looked older than her age. Constant worry had left its mark around her eyes, and her hair, which she once wore long, was now cut short. It was more practical that way. Her job as a manager at Greystone Foods required early mornings and late shifts. "Mom, do we have any milk?" Tommy's voice interrupted her thoughts. The 16-year-old teenager appeared in the kitchen in his school uniform, his hair tousled from sleep. "In the fridge, dear. Breakfast is on the table." Beatrice made eggs and toast, a simple breakfast they could afford. The days of buying expensive cereal or fresh fruit every day were long gone. Ever since Bert's construction company started cutting back on orders, the family budget had become a source of constant stress. "Is Dad not getting up again?" Tommy asked, spreading butter on his toast. "He worked late. Let him sleep." It was a half-truth. Bert did come home late, but in recent months, Beatrice had noticed that her husband had become more withdrawn. He used to share his work problems and talk about his projects. Now he limited himself to one-word answers and went to watch TV. The phone rang at 7 in the morning as Beatrice was getting ready for work. "B, it's Clyde." Her brother's voice sounded tired. Beatrice felt a familiar tightness in her stomach. Clyde's calls rarely brought good news. "Hi, what's wrong?" "I got fired yesterday. From the factory. They're closing our entire department." Beatrice sank into a chair. Clyde had worked at the Cleveland auto plant for the past 10 years. It was a stable job with good money. "Oh my God, Clyde. What are you going to do?" "I don't know. They're giving me severance pay, but that will only last 2 months at most." "B, can I come stay with you for a few days? Until I find something new." Beatrice looked around the kitchen, at the bills stacked on the refrigerator, at the empty coffee can she planned to replace with cheaper instant coffee. "Of course, come on over. Your family." After the call, she sat in silence, calculating her expenses. An extra mouth meant more spending on food, water, electricity. But Clyde was her only brother, and after their parents died, they had stuck together. Bert came downstairs at 8, when Beatrice was already late for work. He looked exhausted, the stubble on his face suggesting he had forgotten to shave. "Clyde's coming today," she said, buttoning her coat. "He got fired." Bert poured himself some coffee without looking up. "For long?" "I don't know, until he finds a job." "Great," Bert muttered. "Just what we need." "Bert, he's my brother." "I know who he is, B. It's just that we have our own problems." It was a truth they both tried not to discuss. The mortgage, the car loan, Tommy's high school tuition bills, it all weighed heavily on the family budget. Bert's income as a foreman had fallen by 30% since the beginning of the year, when construction projects in the area began to shut down one after another. "We'll talk tonight," Beatrice said as she left the house. At Grayson Foods, the day passed in the usual hustle and bustle. Beatrice checked deliveries, dealt with staff issues, and listened to customer complaints. Work distracted her from her domestic problems, but by evening, her fatigue had snowballed. At 6 o'clock, as she was closing the store, she saw a familiar pickup truck in the parking lot. Clyde was sitting behind the wheel, smoking a cigarette. At 32, he looked older than Beatrice, even though he was 3 years younger. Life had not been kind to him. Divorce, alcohol problems that he hid, but not very successfully, and now the loss of his job. "Hi, sis," he smiled, hugging her. The smell of tobacco and cheap cologne was familiar from childhood. "How are you? How was your drive?" "Fine. My things are in the car, just a few things." They drove home in his pickup truck. Beatrice leaving her car in the store parking lot, saving on gas, had become a habit. "How are things with Bert?" Clyde asked on the way. Difficult. There's not much work, and even less money. He's changed. Different how? Beatrice thought about how to explain the changes she had noticed in her husband. Secretive. We used to talk about everything. Now he comes home, eats dinner, and goes to the living room to watch TV until midnight. Maybe it's stress? Probably. Tommy met them at home and helped Clyde carry his things into the guest room. Bert was sitting at the kitchen table with a beer and didn't look very happy to see his brother-in-law. "Bert," Clyde nodded. "Clyde, I heard you got laid off." "Yeah, the factory's closing. Looking for a new job." The conversation was awkward. Beatrice remembered a time when Bert and Clyde got along well and even went fishing together. But over the past couple of years, a coldness had developed between them. At dinner, they talked mainly about work, Tommy's school, and Clyde's plans. Bert was silent, occasionally nodding or responding with monosyllables. "Tomorrow I'll go look at the classifieds," Clyde said. "Maybe I'll find something in a warehouse or in trucking." "There aren't many jobs anywhere right now," Bert remarked. "Half the guys from our company are already sitting at home." "Something will turn up." After dinner, Clyde helped clear the table while Bert went into the living room. Beatrice washed the dishes, thinking about how they would manage the extra expenses. "Don't worry," Clyde said, wiping the table. "I'll find a job quickly, and I'll help with the money as soon as I can." "I know. It's just tough for everyone right now." "How are you and Bert? Really, how are things?" Beatrice paused, holding a wet plate in her hands. The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. "We're getting by, in different ways. The stress is affecting everyone." That was true, but not the whole truth. In recent months, Beatrice had felt a growing distance between her and Bert. He had become indifferent to her problems at work, lost interest in her weekend plans, and even physical intimacy had become rare. Late in the evening, when Clyde had settled into the guest room and Tommy was doing his homework, Beatrice and Bert were alone in the bedroom. "How long is he going to stay here?" Bert asked as he undressed. "He's looking for a job. Give him time." "We don't have any money ourselves, B. Look at the bills." Bert pointed to the stack of envelopes on the dresser. Beatrice knew what was in there. The electric bill they had been putting off for 2 weeks, a notice from the bank about a late credit card payment, a reminder about car insurance. "What are you suggesting? That we kick my brother out onto the street?" "I'm suggesting that we think about our family first." They went to bed in silence, each on their own side of the bed. Beatrice lay in the dark, listening to her husband's breathing and thinking about when their life had become so complicated. They used to be able to talk about everything and solve problems together. Now every conversation turned into an argument about money or responsibilities. In the next room, Clyde watched television at low volume. Tomorrow would be a new day, with new problems and old unresolved issues. Beatrice closed her eyes, hoping that everything would seem easier in the morning. A week had passed since Clyde's arrival, and the atmosphere in the house on Maple Street had become even more tense. Beatrice woke up every morning feeling like she was balancing on the edge of a precipice, where the slightest wrong move could destroy their fragile stability. The family's financial situation was deteriorating by the day. The electricity bill they had been putting off paying had turned into a disconnection notice. Beatrice found it in the mailbox on Thursday evening, and her hands trembled as she read the final warning: they had 3 days to pay the $487 debt, or the electricity would be cut off. That night, she tried to discuss it with Bert, but the conversation quickly turned into an argument. He was sitting in the living room, staring at the TV, which was showing some fishing program. Beatrice stood between him and the screen, holding the bill in her hands. "We need to make a decision. Now." Bert didn't even look at her. "Move away. I'm watching." "Bert, in 3 days they'll cut off our electricity." Only then did he turn his head, and Beatrice saw irritation in his eyes, not concern. It was as if she were interrupting him from doing something important, rather than trying to save their family from financial ruin. After that conversation, Beatrice lay in bed listening to Bert take a shower. The water ran longer than usual, and she thought about the water bill, which was also increasing every month. Bert used to be thrifty, turning off the lights when he left a room and taking quick showers. Now he seemed to have forgotten all their agreements. Clyde, despite his daily job search, had not yet found anything suitable. He would leave in the morning in his pickup truck, driving around warehouses, auto repair shops, and construction sites, but he would return with the same disappointed expression on his face. The job market in Greystone and the surrounding area was overflowing with people like him, skilled workers without jobs. However, Beatrice noticed something strange. Whereas Bert had previously treated Clyde with cold politeness, now a special bond was beginning to form between them. It showed in small ways, in how Bert would linger in the kitchen while Clyde drank his morning coffee, in their quiet conversations that would stop when she entered the room. She first noticed it on Saturday morning. Beatrice got up later than usual and heard quiet voices coming from the kitchen. As she descended the stairs, she recognized Bert's laughter, that rare, genuine laughter she hadn't heard in months. When she entered the kitchen, both men fell silent. Bert turned away toward the window, and Clyde busied himself with his phone. "What were you talking about?" she asked, pouring herself some coffee. "Fishing," Clyde replied without looking up. "Bert was telling me about Lake Erie." But something in their posture, in the way they avoided looking at each other, told Beatrice that the conversation was not about fishing. There was a tension between them, almost intimate, that she couldn't explain. In the days that followed, this strange closeness between her husband and brother only intensified. Bert started coming home early, which surprised Beatrice, considering he didn't have much work. He used to stay late at the construction site or at the bar with his colleagues, but now he hurried home. And at home, he spent his time not with her or Tommy, but in the garage with Clyde, supposedly helping him fix his pickup truck. The sounds from the garage carried into the house, the clang of metal tools, muffled voices, occasional laughter. Beatrice tried to join them a couple of times, but she felt out of place. They discussed technical details that didn't interest her, but that wasn't the point. It was the way they looked at each other, the way Bert leaned in very close to explain something to Clyde, the way their hands accidentally touched when they passed tools to each other. One evening, while Beatrice was cooking dinner, she looked out the window and saw them in the garage. The door was ajar, and in the strip of light she could see Bert showing Clyde something under the hood of the pickup truck. They were standing very close, their shoulders almost touching, and there was something about their closeness that made her heart tighten with an inexplicable anxiety. Tommy also noticed the changes in the house. The 16-year-old teenager began to stay longer at school and participate in sports clubs that he had not been interested in before. When Beatrice asked him about it, he shrugged and said that things had become strange at home. He couldn't explain what exactly was strange, but Beatrice understood his feelings. The atmosphere in the house had indeed changed. Before, despite financial difficulties, they had remained a family. Now it seemed that everyone existed in their own world. Beatrice worked and worried about money, Tommy avoided home, and Bert and Clyde spent their time in some reality of their own, from which she was excluded. The culmination of the first 2 weeks was the credit card incident. Beatrice discovered that the card limit had been exhausted when she tried to buy groceries at her own store. The terminal declined the transaction in front of her colleagues, and she had to apologize, saying she had forgotten her other card at home. The humiliation was painful, but worse was that she didn't understand what the money had been spent on. At home, she checked her statement online and found some strange expenses. A gas station at 1 a.m. the Wednesday before last, when Bert, in her opinion, was sleeping at home. A purchase at a 24-hour store on the other side of town on Saturday, when he was supposedly fixing the car in the garage. A bill from a restaurant they had never been to. When she tried to ask Bert about these expenses, he became defensive with an aggressiveness that was uncharacteristic of him. "Are you following me now? I'm trying to figure out where our money is going. We don't have an extra $300. Maybe you bought something yourself and forgot." But Beatrice knew for sure that she hadn't bought anything at that restaurant, and she hadn't filled up at 1 in the morning. What's more, Bert's car had been parked in the driveway that evening. She remembered because she was upset that he had come home late again. The next morning, she found a receipt from that restaurant in Bert's jeans pocket while folding laundry. The receipt was for 2 people, 2 main courses, 2 beers, 1 dessert. The date and time matched the credit card statement. Beatrice stood in the laundry room, holding that piece of paper in her hands, and felt the world around her begin to crumble. Who had Bert had dinner with? And why had he lied to her about it? She thought about Clyde, about their strange closeness, about how they fell silent when she appeared. She thought about how, on the evening when Bert was supposedly working late, Clyde wasn't home either. He said he had gone to meet with a potential employer. Beatrice put the check back in her jeans pocket and continued sorting the laundry, but her thoughts wouldn't leave her alone. There was something she didn't understand, something happening right under her nose, and she was blind to it. That same evening, she decided to talk to Clyde directly. She waited until Bert went to take a shower and Tommy sat down to do his homework, then went out to her brother in the garage. He was working on the engine, his hands black with oil. "Clyde, I need to talk to you." He didn't look up from the engine. "About what?" "About Bert. About what's going on between you two." Now he straightened up and looked at her. Something flashed in his eyes. Fear, guilt. "I don't know what you're talking about. You've become very close, very quickly. We just get along. Guys are guys." But his voice sounded unconvincing, and he turned back to the engine. Beatrice sensed that he was hiding something, but she didn't know how to get him to talk. "Clyde, if something is going on, if you have some business that is affecting our family, you're thinking too much. We're just friends. We get along fine." She wanted to tell him about the check, about the strange expenses, about how Bert had changed beyond recognition since his arrival. But something in her brother's posture, in the way he avoided her gaze, made her keep quiet. That night, Beatrice lay awake, listening to every sound in the house. Bert was sleeping next to her, but even in his sleep he seemed distant. She thought about how she had known him for over 10 years, had been married to him for 8, and now, for the first time, felt like she was living with a stranger. At breakfast that morning, Bert and Clyde exchanged meaningful glances again. When Bert passed Clyde the salt, their fingers touched, and Beatrice noticed that the contact lasted a second longer than necessary. It was a small detail that could have been accidental, but in the context of everything that was happening, it took on an ominous meaning. By the end of the second week, Beatrice felt like a stranger in her own home. Bert and Clyde had created a closed system in which there was no place for her. They joked over breakfast, planned weekend activities together, discussed plans for home renovations, but all of this happened without her participation. The worst part was that the financial situation continued to deteriorate. The electricity hadn't been cut off yet. Beatrice had borrowed money from her bank manager, an old friend, but it was only a temporary measure. Debts were mounting, and income wasn't growing. Clyde was still unemployed, Bert was bringing in less and less money, and she was shouldering all the financial responsibility alone. Beatrice began to realize that their family was heading for some kind of disaster, but she didn't know how to prevent it. Everything she tried to do, talk to her husband, find out the truth about his spending, understand the nature of his friendship with Clyde, was met with a wall of silence and lies. The third week of October brought Beatrice discoveries that made her question her own sanity. It all started with a small thing, Clyde's forgotten phone on the kitchen table on Wednesday morning. Beatrice was cleaning up breakfast when the screen lit up with an incoming message. She wasn't going to read someone else's correspondence, but the sender's name made her pause. Bert. The message was short. "Meet me at the usual place at 8. Don't be late." Beatrice stood with a rag in her hands, staring at the phone screen. At 7:30 in the morning, Bert was already at work. At least that's what he said when he left the house an hour ago. What usual place? What meetings did she not know about? The phone went dark, and she put it back in its place, but her thoughts kept her restless all day. At the store, she went through the motions, checking deliveries, talking to staff, solving current problems. But part of her mind kept returning to that message. Usual place implied regularity, a system. So these meetings weren't the first time. In the evening, she tried to indirectly find out from Bert where he had been during the day. She asked about work, projects, colleagues. He answered evasively, saying that it had been a normal day, nothing special. But she noticed a wariness in his eyes, like a person who is expecting a trick. The next day, Beatrice decided to conduct an experiment. She called Bert at work at 8:30 in the morning, supposedly to remind him about his insurance bill. The secretary of the construction company said that Bert had not yet arrived, even though the working day began at 8. When Beatrice asked if he was sick, the secretary was surprised. It turned out that Bert hadn't been at work for 3 days. After hanging up the phone, Beatrice felt the ground slip away from under her feet. For 3 days, Bert had been leaving the house supposedly to go to work, but his whereabouts were unknown. He was with Clyde, at the usual place. On Friday evening, an incident occurred that finally convinced Beatrice that something serious was going on in her house. She returned home earlier than usual. The store was closed for inventory, and saw that Bert's car was not in the driveway, even though he should have been home. Clyde's pickup truck was also missing. When she entered the house, she found a note on the refrigerator. Went to get parts for the pickup truck. We'll be back for dinner. K. The handwriting was Clyde's, but something about the note seemed unnatural to Beatrice. Too formal for her brother, too rehearsed, as if they had prepared an explanation in advance in case their absence was noticed. She went up to the bedroom and began to carefully examine Bert's belongings. In a drawer, under a stack of socks, she found crumpled receipts from various establishments, cafes, gas stations, even a motel on Highway 71, 40 miles from Greystone. The receipts covered the last 2 weeks, and all of them were from working hours. The strangest find was a receipt from a men's clothing store. Bert had bought something for $89 on Tuesday afternoon. Beatrice went to his closet and found a new shirt she hadn't seen before. An expensive one, clearly not the kind he usually wore to work. The shirt hung neatly ironed, as if ready for a special occasion. The worst part was that all these purchases were made on days when Clyde was supposedly looking for work, and Bert was supposedly working. It turned out that they were spending their days together, spending family money for unknown purposes, and lying to her about it. Over the weekend, Beatrice decided to check her suspicions through her acquaintances. First, she turned to Linda Morris, the wife of Bert's colleague. They met at Annie's Cafe on Main Street, one of the few places in Greystone where you could still eat and talk normally. Linda was a straightforward woman, the kind who didn't like to beat around the bush. When Beatrice cautiously asked how things were going with the men at the construction site, Linda answered bluntly, "Things are bad. Half the guys are sitting at home without work. My Rick says Bert hasn't shown up in 2 weeks. Didn't he tell you?" Beatrice tried to hide her shock. "He said there wasn't much work. I didn't think it was that bad." "Yeah. And you know what's strange? Rick saw him Wednesday morning near the motel on Highway 71. He was riding with some guy in a pickup truck. Rick wanted to say hello, but they quickly turned away." The motel on Highway 71. The same one whose check Beatrice had found in the dresser. From Linda's, she went to Betty Harrison's, a neighbor who lived across the street and was in the habit of keeping track of everything that happened in the neighborhood. Betty was home, as always, and happy to share her observations. "Your brother is a handsome man," she said, offering Beatrice tea. "And hard-working. I see him leave early every morning. He's looking for a job." "Yeah. And your Bert goes with him to help?" Beatrice felt her heart skip a beat. "What do you mean?" "Well, they leave together. Every day. In your brother's pickup truck. Bert leaves his car at home and rides with Clyde. I thought you knew." Betty described a picture that completely destroyed all the explanations Bert and Clyde had given her every morning right after Beatrice left for work. They would get in the pickup truck and drive away together. They would return at different times, sometimes in the afternoon, sometimes in the evening, and always together. "And you know what else is strange?" Betty continued. "The night before last, I saw them near your house at about 2 in the morning. They were sitting in the pickup truck talking. They sat there for a long time. I was about to go to bed, and they were still sitting there." Beatrice remembered the night before last. Bert came into the bedroom around midnight and said he had been helping Clyde with his car in the garage. So after that, they sat outside for 2 hours talking about something. What could you talk about for 2 hours in a car in the middle of the night? When she returned home, Beatrice found that Bert and Clyde had left again. This time there was no note. Tommy was sitting in his room, doing his homework and listening to music on his headphones. The house felt empty and cold. She went to the garage where Clyde's pickup truck was supposedly being repaired. The car was in the same place, the hood closed. Beatrice opened it and saw a perfectly clean engine. No signs of repair, no dismantled parts, no tools. Even the dust lay untouched. All the repairs, all those hours in the garage, all the talk about technical problems, it was all a lie. But why? What were they hiding? On Sunday, Beatrice made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable to her a month ago. She would keep an eye on her own husband. She would find out where he was going, who he was meeting, and what he was spending their last money on. The plan was simple. On Monday morning, she would go to work as usual, but instead of going to the store, she would park a few blocks from home and wait. As soon as Bert and Clyde left in the pickup truck, she would follow them. On Sunday evening, she tried to act normal. She made dinner, watched TV, and talked to Tommy about school. Bert and Clyde sat in the living room discussing their plans for tomorrow. Bert said he had an important meeting with a contractor, and there might be work. Clyde added that he was going to look at a warehouse where they could get a job as a loader. Beatrice nodded and smiled, but inside, she was burning with anger. How easily they lied to her, how naturally they made these false plans. And the worst thing was that they clearly enjoyed their deception, exchanging glances as if they shared a secret known only to the two of them. As she went to bed, Beatrice felt like a spy in her own home. Next to her lay the husband with whom she had lived for 8 years, had a son, and shared joys and sorrows. Now he seemed like a stranger to her, a man capable of deception and betrayal. Bert fell asleep quickly, as he always had in recent weeks. Before, he could toss and turn for hours, thinking about work problems and making plans for the future. Now he fell asleep like a man with a clear conscience, with tomorrow promising pleasure. Beatrice lay awake until 3 in the morning, replaying all her suspicions and guesses in her head. The motel on the highway, the new shirt, the late-night conversations in the car, the usual meeting place, the lies about work, the lies about car repairs, the strange closeness between her husband and his brother. All these facts added up to a picture she was afraid to admit even to herself. But tomorrow, she would find out the truth, whatever it was. On Monday morning, Beatrice got up as usual, made breakfast, and said goodbye to her family. Bert kissed her on the cheek, quickly, almost formally. Clyde waved from behind his newspaper. Everything looked normal, ordinary. She got in the car and drove to the store, but 2 blocks before her destination, she turned left and parked near an abandoned car wash, from where she could see their house. She didn't have to wait long. 10 minutes later, Bert and Clyde came out of the house, got into the pickup truck, and drove toward the city center. Beatrice started the engine and followed, keeping a safe distance. Her heart was beating so loudly that it seemed to be audible from outside. She was following her husband, her own husband. A month ago, this would have been unthinkable. The pickup truck turned onto the main road and headed toward the outskirts of Grayson. Beatrice followed cautiously, losing sight of them several times at turns, but finding them again each time. They weren't heading toward the industrial zone, where there were construction sites and warehouses. They were heading toward the residential areas on the eastern outskirts of the city. 20 minutes later, the pickup turned into a small cottage community, a place where people with higher incomes than Beatrice's family lived. The houses here were larger, the lots more spacious, the cars more expensive. Beatrice stopped at the corner so as not to attract attention and saw the pickup truck pull up to one of the houses in the middle of the block. Bert and Clyde got out and headed for the front door. The door opened before they reached it, as if someone was waiting for them. A man about their age stood in the doorway, but Beatrice couldn't make out his face from that distance. He greeted them like old friends, hugging each of them. All three went inside. Beatrice sat in the car, staring at the closed door, knowing that she was on the verge of discoveries that could destroy her life. But there was no turning back. She had to find out the whole truth. Beatrice sat in the car near the cottage for almost 2 hours, but Bert and Clyde did not come out. The house remained quiet, the curtains on the windows tightly drawn. Several times she saw shadows moving behind the glass, but it was impossible to make out anything specific. Time dragged agonizingly slowly, and the darkest assumptions swarmed in her head. Around noon, the front door finally opened. The first to come out was an unfamiliar man, tall, well-dressed, about 40 years old. Behind him were Bert and Clyde. All three looked relaxed and content. The stranger was saying something, gesturing, and the others were laughing. The scene looked like old friends saying goodbye after a pleasant time together. The men hugged each other goodbye, not formally, but warmly, like friends. The stranger patted Bert on the shoulder and whispered something in his ear. Bert nodded and smiled a smile that Beatrice hadn't seen in months. When the pickup truck pulled away, Beatrice started the engine and followed at a safe distance. This time they headed for the city center, to the shopping district. Beatrice thought that maybe now they would really go look for work, as they had promised. But the pickup turned into the parking lot of a large Walmart on the edge of the shopping center. Beatrice parked in the far row, where she could watch the entrance. Bert and Clyde got out of the car and headed for the store, but not as shoppers. They walked slowly, talking about something, stopping periodically. Their behavior seemed strange to Beatrice, too relaxed for people who were supposedly looking for work. She waited a few minutes, then got out of the car and headed for the store entrance. Inside Walmart, it was quite crowded for a weekday. Seniors, mothers with children, teenagers skipping school. Beatrice took a shopping cart so as not to attract attention and began looking for her husband and brother among the shoppers. She found them in the electronics department, in the far corner of the store, where there were fewer people. They were standing near the TV display, but clearly had no intention of buying anything. Clyde was holding a box of some kind, showing it to Bert. Beatrice moved closer, hiding behind the tall shelves of merchandise. What she saw next made her heart stop. Bert and Clyde were standing very close to each other, closer than is customary between relatives or friends. Clyde was saying something, leaning close to Bert's ear, his lips almost touching his skin. Bert listened with his eyes closed, his face wearing an expression that Beatrice knew very well, the same one he had during their intimate moments. Then Clyde stepped back and looked around to make sure no one was watching them. Satisfied that they were alone in that part of the store, he put his hand on Bert's neck and pulled him toward him. What happened next destroyed Beatrice's world completely. They kissed. Not in a friendly or brotherly way. It was a long, passionate kiss between lovers. Bert hugged Clyde around the waist, pulling him close. Their bodies merged into one, and they kissed with such passion as if they hadn't seen each other for months. Beatrice stood behind the shelving unit, holding onto the cart to keep from falling. The world around her swayed, the sounds of the store turning into an indistinct hum. Her husband, her brother, together, here, in a public place, risking being seen, but unable to keep their hands off each other. How long had this been going on? Weeks? Months? Their entire friendship, all the time spent in the garage, all the secret meetings. It had all been a lie, a cover for the affair between her husband and her brother. The men finally broke their kiss, but did not move away from each other. Clyde stroked Bert's cheek, whispering something tenderly. Bert smiled that happy smile that Beatrice remembered from their honeymoon. Only now that smile was not for her, but for her brother. Beatrice felt something break inside her with an almost physical crack. 8 years of marriage, a child together, plans for the future. All this time, Bert had been lying to her, using her as a cover for his true desires. And Clyde was her brother, the only family she had left after her parents died. He had betrayed her in a way that only the closest people can betray. But the worst part was realizing that they had enjoyed their deception. They had watched her struggle to understand what was going on and continued to play their game. Perhaps they had even laughed at her naivety. Fragments of memories from the last few weeks flashed through Beatrice's mind. Their laughter from the garage, the meaningful glances at breakfast, the late-night conversations in the car, the usual place for meetings, the motel on the highway, the house in the affluent neighborhood. It all came together into a picture of betrayal so monstrous that it was hard to believe it was real. Rage washed over her suddenly, like a tsunami. Beatrice felt the blood rush to her face, her hands begin to tremble. She left the cart and headed toward them, without thinking about the consequences, driven only by the desire to destroy their little performance. "How sweet," she said, stepping out from behind the shelf. Bert and Clyde jumped away from each other as if scalded. The look of horror froze on both their faces. Clyde turned pale. Bert opened his mouth but couldn't utter a word. "B," Clyde began. "Shut up," she hissed. "Just shut up." The whole store around them seemed to freeze. Customers continued to walk down the aisles, but for Beatrice, only these two people existed, the ones who had ruined her life. "How long?" she asked, looking at Bert. "How long have you been lying to me?" Bert tried to pull himself together. "B, let's talk at home. Calm down." "Calm down?" Beatrice's voice rose an octave. "You want me to calm down? After what I've seen?" Several shoppers turned to look at them. A family quarrel in the electronics department attracted attention, but Beatrice didn't care. Her world was falling apart and let the whole store witness its collapse. "It's not what you think," Clyde said, but his voice sounded unconvincing even to himself. "Not what I think? I saw you kissing. I saw you groping my husband. B, please." "My brother," she continued, ignoring his words. "My own brother. I let you into my house. I fed you. I cared for you. And you slept with my husband." Tears of rage burned her eyes, but she wasn't going to cry. Not here, not in front of them. They didn't deserve her tears. Bert took a step forward, reaching out his hand. "B, listen. Don't you dare touch me!" She recoiled from him. "Don't you dare! You touched him. My brother. In my house. In our bed?" Bert's silence was his answer. Beatrice saw guilt on his face, and something else. Relief? Was he glad the lie was finally over? "In our bed," she repeated, and it was a statement, not a question. "When I was at work, when Tommy was at school, you had sex in our bedroom." "B, I can explain," Bert began, but his voice sounded as if he himself didn't believe an explanation was possible. "Explain?" Beatrice laughed, and even to her, the sound of it was frightening. "What are you going to explain? That you're gay? That our marriage is a sham? That you've been using me all these years?" A small crowd of onlookers had gathered around them. Someone took out their phone to film. A security guard was heading their way, but Beatrice didn't notice anything around her. "It's not like that," Bert said. "I didn't plan it. It just happened." "Happened?" Beatrice felt a new wave of rage rising. "What happened? Did you stick your tongue in my brother's mouth?" Clyde tried to stand between them. "B, stop. People are watching." "Let them watch. Let them all see what you are. Let them know that my husband and my brother." She didn't have time to finish her sentence. In the far corner of the department, she noticed a stand with kitchen knives. Without thinking, driven by blind rage, she grabbed one of the knives, a large one with a wide blade, designed for cutting meat. "B, no!" Clyde shouted, but it was too late. The knife entered Bert's chest easily, as if cutting through butter. He looked at her in surprise, then down at the handle sticking out of his chest. Blood began to seep through his shirt, the very new shirt he had bought for his meetings with Clyde. "B," he whispered, and fell to his knees. The world around him exploded with screams. People scattered in panic. Someone called the police. Clyde rushed to Bert, trying to stop the bleeding, but his hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't do anything. Beatrice stood over her dying husband and felt a strange calm. The rage had disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind a void. She looked at the blood spreading across the linoleum and realized that her life was over. Not just her marriage, not just her family, her whole life. Security guards surrounded her, but she did not resist. One of them gently took her hand, which was covered in Bert's blood. Another spoke into a radio, calling for an ambulance. Clyde wept over Bert's body, pressing his head to his chest. Now that the pretense was over, he did not hide his feelings. His grief was sincere, primal. He had lost his loved one, and the whole world could see the depth of his pain. The police arrived 8 minutes later. Beatrice meekly allowed herself to be handcuffed, got into the patrol car, and answered the first questions. Everything happened as if in a dream, unreal and detached. The ambulance crew pronounced Bert dead at the scene. The knife had pierced his heart, and death had come almost instantly. Clyde was taken to the hospital. He had suffered a nervous breakdown, unable to stop crying and repeating Bert's name over and over. At the police station, Detective Sarah Thompson began the interrogation. She was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and professional calm. She had seen many different cases in her career, but family tragedies were always the hardest for her. "Tell me what happened," she said, turning on the tape recorder. Beatrice told her everything, about her suspicions, about the surveillance, about what she saw in the store. She spoke evenly, without emotion, as if reading someone else's story. The detective listened, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Did you plan to kill your husband?" "No. I didn't even know I was going to take the knife. It just happened." "Do you regret what happened?" Beatrice thought for a moment. Did she regret it? Bert was dead. Her life was ruined. Tommy was an orphan. But the man she had killed was not her husband. Her husband had died earlier, the moment he decided to betray her with his own brother. "I regret many things," she said finally, "but not finding out the truth." Detective Thompson nodded and turned off the tape recorder. The case was simple and complicated at the same time. Simple because there were many witnesses, the motive was obvious, and the suspect confessed. Complicated because human relationships are always complicated, especially when it comes to betrayal and broken hearts. The investigation into the Beatrice Connor case began the day after the tragedy. Detective Sarah Thompson arrived at the office at 6 in the morning, an hour before her shift started, to review all the evidence that had been gathered. On her desk lay witness statements, surveillance camera footage from Walmart, initial medical reports, and a stack of photos from the crime scene. The case seemed straightforward in terms of the facts. The murder was committed in front of multiple witnesses, the murder weapon was found, and the suspect confessed. But Thompson knew that family crimes were rarely simple. Behind every such case were months or years of accumulated problems that ultimately led to an explosion. Her first stop was the hospital to question Clyde Wright. The man had spent the night under observation by doctors after a nervous breakdown. By morning, his condition had stabilized enough for them to talk. Clyde sat on his hospital bed, staring out the window. He had aged several years overnight. His face was gaunt, his eyes empty, like a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. When Thompson entered the room, he didn't even turn around. "Mr. Wright, I'm Detective Thompson. I need to ask you a few questions about what happened." Clyde was silent for a few minutes, then slowly turned his head. "She killed him." "Yes. Your sister has been arrested, but I need to understand what led to this tragedy." "I did. It's all my fault." The detective turned on her tape recorder and sat down on a chair next to the bed. In her work, it was important not to rush people, to let them speak at their own pace. "Tell me about your relationship with Bert Connor." Clyde closed his eyes and tears ran down his cheeks. "I loved him. I know how that sounds. He was married to my sister. They had a family. But I loved him." The story Clyde told turned out to be more complicated than Thompson had expected. The romance between him and Bert began less than 2 weeks ago, when he came to visit his sister. Their relationship began 3 years ago, when Clyde was still working in Cleveland and coming to Grayson for the weekends. At first, it was just friendship. Bert helped Clyde with his car, they went fishing, watched sports. Gradually, the friendship grew into something more. Neither of them had ever been in a relationship with a man before, and both were confused by their feelings. "We tried to stop," Clyde said, wiping his tears with the sleeve of his hospital gown. "We knew it was wrong. Bert loved Beatrice, or thought he did. But there was something stronger between us." Their meetings became regular. Clyde would come to Greystone specifically when Beatrice was at work. They would meet in motels, at the home of Bert's friend, who knew about their relationship and provided them with a place to meet. Bert bought new clothes, spent money on restaurants and gifts, all in an attempt to create the illusion of a normal relationship in an abnormal situation. "When I was fired, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't find a job in Cleveland. I had no money. Bert suggested that I move in with them temporarily. He said it would be easier that way. But living under the same roof with Beatrice turned out to be torture for both men. They had to constantly pretend, hide their feelings, and come up with excuses for spending time together. The tension grew with each passing day. We talked about telling her the truth, or about me leaving, but we couldn't make up our minds. Bert was afraid of losing his son, divorce, condemnation, and I just couldn't live without him." Detective Thompson listened to this story and understood that tragedy was inevitable. 3 people locked in an impossible situation, each suffering in their own way. Beatrice didn't know the truth, but she sensed that something was wrong. Bert was torn between his responsibilities and his desires. Clyde lived in constant fear of being exposed. That day, we went to see Danny, a friend of Bert's who knew about us, just to talk, to try to figure out what to do next. Then we decided to stop by Walmart to buy something for Beatrice's house. We wanted to make her happy so she wouldn't suspect anything. And what happened at the store? We thought no one could see us. There were almost no people in that department. I just couldn't help myself. I kissed him, and then B showed up. After Clyde's testimony, Thompson went to inspect the house on Maple Street. Tommy was at the neighbor's house. The boy was in shock from what had happened and couldn't stay in the house where his family had lived just yesterday. Social services had already begun the process of determining his future. The house looked normal, but Thompson's detective eye noticed details that told the story of the family. Stacks of unpaid bills on the kitchen table, an empty refrigerator, old furniture that had once been nice but now looked worn out from time and financial hardship. In Bert and Beatrice's bedroom, she found signs that the couple had been sleeping separately for a long time. Bert's side of the bed was unmade, and his pillow was on the floor. On the bedside table was an empty bottle of sleeping pills. Bert obviously suffered from insomnia. In Clyde's room, the detective found letters he had written but never sent. Letters to Bert, full of love and despair. In one of them, he wrote that he was ready to leave so as not to destroy his family. In another, he begged her not to leave him. The letters painted a portrait of a man who was tormented by his inability to love openly. The most painful discovery was Bert's diary, hidden in the garage among the tools. The entries from the last few months showed the depth of his inner conflict. He wrote about his love for Clyde, his guilt towards Beatrice, and his fear of losing his son. In his last entry, made the day before the tragedy, he wrote, "I can't live like this anymore. Something has to happen. I think B is starting to suspect something." While examining the physical evidence, Thompson interviewed witnesses and acquaintances of the family. The picture that emerged was tragic in every way. Bert's colleagues confirmed that he had not been working for the past 2 weeks, but no one knew why. Some had seen him in the company of an unfamiliar man, but did not think anything of it. Neighbors reported strange behavior in the family, late-night conversations in the yard, frequent trips by Bert and Clyde, and a tense atmosphere in the house. The manager of a motel on Highway 71 identified photos of Bert and Clyde. They had been renting a room about once a week for the past 2 months, always for a few hours in the afternoon. They registered under false names and paid in cash. Danny Harris, Bert's friend, whose house the men visited, initially refused to talk. But when Thompson explained that his testimony could help understand the motives for the crime, he told the truth. Bert and Clyde came to him when they needed a place to meet. He had known about their relationship for over a year, but had not told anyone. "Bert was my friend," Danny said. "I saw how he was suffering. I tried to convince him to tell his wife the truth, but he was afraid. He said it would destroy everyone, Beatrice, Tommy, and himself." After gathering enough information, Thompson pieced together the full picture of events. The story didn't begin that day at Walmart, but years ago, when 2 men fell in love with each other without being able to openly express their feelings. The family's financial problems, Clyde's arrival, the need to constantly hide, all of this created pressure that ultimately led to an explosion. Beatrice's psychiatric evaluation showed that she was in a state of acute emotional stress at the time of the crime. Months of suspicion, financial problems, and feelings of betrayal by those closest to her all led to a momentary lapse of reason when she saw her husband with his brother. She did not plan the murder, Thompson explained to the prosecutor. It was an impulsive act by a person who suddenly saw her whole life collapse. The trial began 4 months after the tragedy. By that time, the Connor family's story had become the talk of Greystone. The small town was abuzz with gossip about the case. Some sympathized with Beatrice, considering her a victim of deception. Others condemned her for the murder. Still others blamed Clyde, who had destroyed the family. Tommy was living with distant relatives in a neighboring town at the time. The boy was struggling to cope with the loss of his father and the arrest of his mother. Social services recommended psychological help, but recovery was difficult for him. At the trial, Beatrice's lawyer based his defense on temporary emotional distress and the provocative behavior of the victim. He presented the court with a complete picture of the deception to which his client had been subjected and showed financial documents proving that family money had been spent on her husband's affair. The prosecutor insisted that, despite the provocation, murder was still murder. Beatrice could have left, filed for divorce, or found other ways to solve the problem. Instead, she chose violence. Clyde testified as a witness, and his presence in the courtroom was painful for everyone. He had aged, lost weight, and spoke quietly and with difficulty. His testimony confirmed the defense's version of prolonged deception, but also showed the depth of his love for Bertha. "I don't condone what we did," he said, addressing the jury. "But we loved each other. It wasn't a game or an experiment. We truly loved each other and didn't know how to live with it." The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict was a compromise, guilty of manslaughter with mitigating circumstances. The judge sentenced Beatrice to 8 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 5 years. When the sentence was announced, Beatrice stood calmly, showing no emotion. She accepted the punishment as inevitable. In her final statement to the court, she said only, "I regret what happened, but I don't regret learning the truth." After the trial, Detective Thompson met Clyde in the courthouse hallway. He was about to leave Grayson, a town where every corner reminded him of Bertha and had become unbearable for him. "What are you going to do next?" she asked. "I don't know. I'll try to live. I'll try to forgive myself, even though it seems impossible." "What about Tommy?" "He doesn't want to see me. I don't blame him. I destroyed his family." Clyde left, and Thompson never saw him again. Rumor had it that he had moved to the West Coast and started a new life under a different name. Tommy stayed with relatives, finished school, and went to college. He rarely visited his mother in prison and never talked about what had happened. The trauma was too deep to be completely healed. The Connor family case was one of the most difficult in Detective Thompson's career. Not because it was difficult to investigate, but because there were no real villains. Only people who loved, suffered, and made mistakes that led to tragedy.